I have a Provincetown story that you might find amusing. Uh, when Paul Georges died, I went to his memorial, and Paul Resica, who you know, told this amazing story of his first encounter with Paul Georges. Now, uh, Paul Georges had been a teacher at Penn who was terribly pop. He was really very interested in my paintings. He spent a lot of time with me, and we used to go to lunch all the time at the Christian Brothers Association there. And anyway, after I graduated, Paul called me on the phone from New York, and he said, "You belong in New York. I found a studio and a job for you. Here's the address and the name. Go to this place." All right, which was pretty remarkable, really. And but previous to that, he had invited me to his apartment in Soho, and I went to see him. It was the first time I was really in the loft of a real artist, if that makes any sense. And it was in this building on Walker Street, and there was a guy by the name of Red Grooms on the first floor, and there was a guy by the name of Jack Beale, and I mean, they were real, it was a good building. So I get up to Paul's door, and it was one of those black police doors, and I knock on the door, and the lock swings open, and there's this room that was just. There was enormous canvases everywhere, a black table, and a reel-to-reel tape recorder playing. Paul's wife sitting at the table, and everything else was devoted to making art. There was paint, drawings on the floor everywhere. And his daughters had this tiny little room at the back of the loft. And it was so powerful. And I said, this is exactly what I want in life. This is what I was. So anyway, at his memorial, Paul Resica tells this amazing story. Paul
Paul,
Georges wanted to go to the Hoffman School in Provincetown, and he applied and he wasn't accepted. But he decided he was going to go anyway. So what he did was he went to Provincetown, and as the first day of the school, he sets up a canvas on the front lawn of Hoffman's house. So Hoffman's in there with all the students in the studio space, and he glances out the window and he sees this big canvas on an easel out in front of his house. And he turns to Paul Resica, who was his first day, and he said, "Go outside and ask that guy what he's doing." So Paul went out. Paul had never met Paul Georges, and he went outside and he said, um, "Mr. Hoffman wants to know who you are, and he wants to know what you're doing." And he said, "Well, you tell Mr. Hoffman my name is Paul Georges, and you ask Mr. Hoffman if he's blind because the only reason he doesn't know what I'm doing is because he can't see." So he goes back in and he says all this to Hoffman. And Hoffman says, "You go out there and you tell that son of a bitch to get off of my land." So he says, I go out and I said, "Mr. Hoffman says you're not allowed to paint here. You're on his land." And he said, "You tell Mr. Hoffman to look at my painting and he can see I'm not painting his land. What I'm painting is over there." And so he goes back inside and he tells Hoffman that. He says, Hoffman then turns and says, "You tell that son of a bitch to come inside. I want to talk to him." So he comes in and Hoffman says to him, he says, "Kid, you want to paint?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "Then take a spot here in the room and you work with us." So that's how he got into the Hoffman School. So then Resica said, he said, "I was so fascinated by this guy's so audacious behavior. So I asked him afterwards, he said, "Where do you live?" And he gave me an address. So he said, I decided at the end of the day, I would go visit him just to hang out with him. I wanted to know more about him. So I went to the address and he said, I knock at the door and this woman comes to the door and he said, "I'm looking for Paul George." And she said, "Well, he's not here." He said, "No, he gave me this address." She said, "Oh," she said, "Out back." So he goes out back and there's a garage. And he goes to the garage and he knocks on the door. The door's closed. And that's where Paul George's was. He was in the garage. He opens the door to the garage, and there's a World War I Army cot with a record player, with one classical record on the record player, and a book by James Joyce, Ulysses, laying on the army cot. And the entire garage is filled with canvases. And I said, not much changed in that man's life over 50 years and a whole lifetime of making art and becoming a famous New York painter. And the values were exactly the same. I thought it was just a beautiful circular story of, how it all begins and how it ends.